Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head on UATV, and I'm Vivica Williams. While Russia held its illegal elections in the occupied Crimea, a host of Western countries, from Finland to the United States, made statements that Crimea is Ukraine. To discuss the Russian elections and their impact, we are joined in the studio today by Yulia Osmolovska, Executive Director of the Institute of Negotiations. Hello, and thanks for being with us today, Yulia.
Hello.
So tell us some things about the political and diplomatic impacts of Russia holding the elections in Crimea.
Well, it was not something unexpected to happen. Obviously, not the elections itself happening in Crimea, so Russia was going to conduct it anyway. And also in terms of international assessment of these illegal elections which were conducted in Crimea. And if you can trace the reaction of a number of countries already that are joining the suit of the first one, which was France, condemning or not recognizing the legality of these elections in Crimea. So it was quite predictable to expect this type of reaction. The only practical question is, so what?
Exactly.
So what next? And this is something that we should think about.
And what are your thoughts with this from the standpoint of what politically can be done or diplomatically, what we might be able to expect from countries?
Yes, so our governments already started to do this campaign asking for more sanctions being introduced on people who were involved in organizing and administering the actual election campaign in Crimea. So hopefully we will be seeing some sort of reaction from the West and the countries which would be ready to widen the sanctions against Russia. But let's wait and see the reaction. Let's wait and see what's happening on the level of meeting of EU ministers of foreign affairs, and then at the level of head of states in a couple of days to come. So we will be able to assess the general trend of this.
And so you're speaking of the council meeting today. So the Foreign Affairs Council of the Council of the EU is meeting. Of course, the issue of Ukraine is one of the discussions, and it seems that the meeting comes hand in hand with the anniversary of the illegal annexation of Crimea, which ironically was March 18th, and they moved the elections to that date. And so do you think that this is on the topic that's on the agenda there, this discussion of the elections as well?
Well, I haven't seen the detailed agenda of today's Foreign Affairs Council, but judging from what I've heard already, so Russia is obviously as an issue on an agenda, and there will be discussions around it. So possibly the implications of these elections in Russia and their part in Crimea, in Ukrainian Crimea, so will be sort of somehow reflected in the general conclusions. Yes, but I also want to, speaking not just about the reaction, how we could expect the reaction of the civilized world towards the elections in Crimea, I have to emphasize that. But in any case, this won't question the actual outcome of the presidential elections as such. So the world and Ukraine have to deal with Russia and with the newly elected or re-elected President Putin for another 6 years.
Right, and there's no change, essentially, in the relations that are going to happen. Well, I mean, we don't know if the relationship will change, but there's no change in the leadership in Russia, regardless of the outcome of voting in Crimea. But what we see was that the OSCE, the EU, refused to send monitors to Crimea. However, Russia invited more than 300 politicians and foreigners, mainly those on the fringe, to be unofficial election observers. And some of these, for example, we know of a German MP who went specifically to Crimea to monitor the elections. So do you see is there a possibility of countries holding their elected officials accountable for these illegal visits to the occupied peninsula?
Well, it depends on the general political culture in the country. For instance, Ukraine has its right to react the way it reacts towards the visits of these foreign officials traveling to Crimea, because later on Ukraine just like sanctions them or make a list of people who are not desirable to enter Ukraine or not recommended to enter Ukraine because they breached these recommendations or regulations.
Right, the Ukrainian law. Yeah.
Yes, but if we are talking about the home countries or the leadership or the legal system of home countries, it would depend on basically the political culture. In any democratic state, I would hardly think about a chancellor prohibiting a German politician traveling wherever he wants just to see the situation, and he can also have has a justifiable explanation of him visiting Crimea. For instance, not just observing the legality of the elections, because it was obvious that elections will be held the way they were, but also just seeing the general environment, the general situation in Crimea. Because this is also important for different people to be able to see by their own eyes what's happening on earth in Crimea.
This is true, but the question is, the issue is that going through Russia, which gives validation that Crimea is part of Russia by going through Russia instead of coming through Ukraine. And I think that's the biggest issue that they're pushing out there, is politicians doing this. But also the politicians who tend to do these are the ones from far-right parties in Europe. And so perhaps that they're not really giving any legitimacy to this, since it's normally these types of politicians who are on the extreme sides of the far-right.
Yes, it's quite expectable that Russia would try to play with those more or less loyal people from far right parties in European countries in order to get their loyalty and more neutral assessment of what's happening in Crimea. They're playing their games, that's it. My only question would be, how far would Ukrainian government could go in the way of assisting different politicians traveling to Crimea? As far as I understand, Ukraine has limited abilities to offer this type of study or field visit to Crimea because of Russia, and therefore it's very difficult for Ukrainian government to offer the alternative route and alternative vision of what's happening on earth.
And this makes you make a very good point. This could be something that Ukraine could use to its advantage by giving politicians who request to be able to go to occupy Crimea, by readily giving them this right to do that. Then that's on Russia if they turn them down to allow them to come across the border. And this could be definitely a better counter to this action. As you said, there needs to be more people who are going in official capacities to be able to see what's going on there and to report.
Yes, it's true, but the only question is it feasible at all at the moment for Ukrainian government to provide this type of opportunities? I highly doubt that, even from the point of physical security of these people who would be trying to enter Crimea through Ukrainian official routes, whether they will be secured in physical terms in there.
It's a lot of questions there.
Yes, a lot of questions.
And it would be, if anything happened to these people while they're in Crimea, this would reflect very poorly on Russia as an occupying authority there.
Yes, it's true. I know a number of Western politicians who are traveling to, say, eastern Ukraine, and they're being warned by their own foreign agencies or foreign affairs ministers not to go to eastern Ukraine because they can't guarantee to secure their physical security. So this is a very sensitive point at the moment, and therefore, as I said in the beginning, Ukrainian authorities are quite limited in their actual ability to offer these opportunities.
Right, and this is also the case, as you said, that people are warned with the same thing if they go to Crimea, whether through legal or illegal means, about not being able to secure their safety. What kinds of takeaways could you give us from this, with the elections? What do you think we might be expecting to see in the next few weeks following this?
Well, naturally, anyone could expect some sort of modification of policy, of foreign policy of President Putin, because, say, if he wanted to do something differently, it won't be a good moment to do these changes before the elections, because someone, if there is about constructive way of interacting with Western countries, would see this as his weakness. Therefore, he might kept all these type of decisions or tactic moves after he was re-elected again. On the other hand, we are seeing sharpening of political counterstance between the Western countries and Russia. So it's very difficult to predict what might be the new strategy of Putin, but it's quite obviously, and he actually hinted about this, that we should expect the changes in the government. We should expect some modifications of economic policy of Russia, and hopefully we would see some changes in foreign policy as well.
Well, we're going to have to wait and see.
It's true.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Yulia.
Thank you.
And today we spoke with Yulia Osmolovska, Executive Director of the Institute of Negotiation Skills. Thank you for watching UATV.